At first light on May 7th, the ocean shimmers like polished steel. I grip the stick as the light carrier Shoho comes into view far below, tiny against the expanse. The scream of the dive cuts through my headset as tracers streak past the canopy. With a steady hand, I line up the crosshairs, thinking only of Fletcher's orders: hit hard, hit fast. Seconds later, my bomb blossoms into orange fire on Shoho's deck, the first Japanese carrier ever sunk by American air power. The morning of May 7, 1942, began like any other aboard the USS Lexington, but the tension in the ready room told a different story. We'd been hunting Japanese carriers for days in these waters southeast of New Guinea, playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek across the Coral Sea. Admiral Fletcher had positioned Task Force 17 to intercept the Japanese invasion fleet heading for Port Moresby, and now the moment we'd trained for was finally here. I checked my watch. 6:30, the briefing had been straightforward. Enemy carrier spotted bearing 180 degrees, distance 175 miles. The Japanese light carrier Shoho and her escorts were steaming northwest, completely unaware that 93 American aircraft were about to rain death from above. "Gentlemen," Lieutenant Commander Hamilton had announced, his voice cutting through the nervous shudder, "this is what we've been waiting for. Intelligence reports a Shoho with at least 2 heavy cruisers and destroyers. She's probably carrying 24 aircraft, maybe more. Our job is simple: send her to the bottom." I felt my stomach tighten as I climbed into the cockpit of my SBD Dauntless. The dive bomber wasn't the fastest aircraft in the Navy, but she was steady as a rock in a dive and could put a 1,000-pound bomb exactly where you wanted it. My rear gunner, Radioman Second Class Thompson, settled into a seat behind me, checking his twin .30 caliber machine guns for the 3rd time since breakfast. "You ready for this, Thompson?" I called back over the engine noise. "Born ready, sir," came his reply, though I could hear the same nervous excitement in his voice that I felt in my own chest. The deck of the Lexington came alive as aircraft engines roared to life. 28 SBD Dauntlesses from Bombing Squadron 2 and Scouting Squadron 2, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 2, and 10 F4F Wildcat fighters formed up for launch. From the Yorktown, 60 more aircraft were preparing to join the strike. It would be the largest coordinated carrier attack in American naval history up to that point. The launch waste textbook perfect. One by one, we rolled down the flight deck and lifted off into the dawn sky, forming up in a loose formation as we climbed to altitude. Below us, the Coral Sea stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface painted gold and orange by the rising sun. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Somewhere out there, the Japanese were waiting. As we flew south, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come since Pearl Harbor. 5 months ago, the Japanese had caught us with our pants down, sinking or damaging 18 ships and killing over 2,400 Americans. The whole Pacific Fleet had been left reeling, and for a while, it seemed like the Japanese could do whatever they wanted. But things were changing. At Doolittle's raid just 3 weeks earlier, 16 B-25 bombers had launched from the Hornet and bombed Japan itself. The psychological impact had been enormous. Suddenly, the Japanese homeland wasn't as safe as they'd thought. And now, here in the Coral Sea, we had a chance to strike another blow. The radio crackled in my headset. "Target in sight, bearing 190 degrees, range 15 miles. My heart began to pound as I peered ahead through the morning haze. There, silhouetted against the blue-green water, was the enemy formation. The Shoho looked impossibly small from 17,000 feet, but I could make out her distinctive profile, a converted merchant vessel, smaller than our fleet carriers, but still dangerous. Around her, like protective wolves, steamed the heavy cruisers Myoko and Haguro, along with several destroyers. "This is strike leader," came the voice of Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon over the radio. "We'll attack from the southwest. Torpedo planes go in first, then the dive bombers. Fighters, keep those Zeros off us." The Japanese had spotted us too. I could see aircraft launching from the Shoho's deck, probably Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero fighters scrambling to intercept us. But they were too late and too few. The Shoho could only carry about 24 aircraft, and most of them were probably already committed to other operations. The attack began with the torpedo planes. I watched from high above as 12 TBD Devastators from both carriers dropped to near sea level and began their approach. The Devastator was already obsolete by 1942 standards, too slow, too vulnerable, but the crews flying them were among the bravest men I'd ever known. They had to fly straight and level for several miles while making their attack run, all while enemy gunners tried to blow them out of the sky. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the Japanese ships like deadly fireworks. Black puffs of smoke filled the air as the destroyers and cruisers opened up with everything they had. I saw one Devastator shudder as flak burst nearby, but the pilot held his course, boring in for the attack. The torpedo runs were textbook perfect. Despite the withering fire, most of the Devastators managed to drop their Mark 13 torpedoes and pull away. I saw several white wakes heading straight for the Japanese ships, but the torpedoes were running too deep, a chronic problem that wouldn't be fixed until later in the war. The Shoho managed to evade most of the attack with sharp turns, though I saw at least 2 hits on escort vessels. Dive bombers, this is strike leader. You're cleared in. Make it count. This was it. I nosed over into a steep dive, the familiar sensation of negative G-force pressing me into my seat. The SBD was in her element now, diving at nearly vertical angles, the engine screaming as we plummeted toward the target. My airspeed indicator climbed past 250 knots, then 280, then 300. The Shoho grew larger and larger in my bomb sight as I dove. At this angle, I could see the organized chaos on her flight deck as crews tried to prepare aircraft for launch while incoming dive bombers screamed down at them from above. Some of the carrier's crew were already running for cover. At 2,500 feet, I could see individual Japanese sailors on the deck. Anti-aircraft fire was coming up at us in streams of red tracers, but the steep angle of our dive made us difficult targets. I felt rather than heard bullets punching through the wings of my Dauntless, but the old bird kept flying. At 1,500 feet, I centered the carrier in my bomb sight and pressed the release button. My 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped away, and I hauled back on the stick with all my strength, pulling out of the dive so hard that my vision went gray around the edges. Behind me, Thompson was already calling out hits. Got her. Direct hit amidships. She's burning. I craned my neck around and saw smoke and flames erupting from the Shoho's flight deck where my bomb had struck. But I was just one of dozens. All around the Japanese carrier, more SBDs were pulling out of their dives, and the cumulative effect was devastating. The attack had taken less than 10 minutes, but in that time, the Shoho had been transformed from a functioning warship into a burning wreck. I counted at least 13 direct hits on the carrier, with more bombs falling on her escorts. Huge columns of black smoke rose from multiple fires, and I could see that her flight deck was completely destroyed. "Scratch one flat top," came Dixon's voice over the radio, using the naval aviator slang for an aircraft carrier. Those 3 words would become famous, marking the first time American air power had sunk a Japanese carrier. But even as we celebrated, the Shoho was fighting for her life. Damage control parties were working frantically to control the fires, and for a moment, it looked like she might survive. Japanese damage control was among the best in the world, and they'd saved ships from worse situations before. It wasn't enough. The fires had spread too far and too fast. At 11:35, just over an hour after our attack, secondary explosions began ripping through the carrier's hull. Her aviation gasoline storage had been breached, and the volatile fuel turned the ship into a floating inferno. From my position in the circling formation, I watched as the Shoho began to list heavily to starboard. Japanese destroyers were already moving in to rescue survivors, but the carrier herself was doomed. At 11:36, she rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, taking 631 of her crew with her. The silence on the radio was profound. We'd done it. We'd actually sunk a Japanese aircraft carrier. After months of defeat and retreat, American naval aviation had finally drawn blood. But there was no time to celebrate. Intelligence reports indicated that 2 more Japanese carriers, the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, were somewhere in the Coral Sea. These weren't converted merchantmen like the Shoho. They were frontline warships, each carrying over 70 aircraft and experienced air crews who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. The flight back to the task force was tense. We'd lost 3 aircraft in the attack on the Shoho, but we'd proven that American pilots could take on the Japanese Navy and win. More importantly, we'd prevented the invasion of Port Moresby, at least for now. As we approached the Lexington and Yorktown, I could see the flight deck crews already preparing for our recovery. But the horizon was empty except for our own ships. Where were the Japanese fleet carriers? The answer came soon enough. At 11 o'clock while we were still attacking the Shoho, Japanese aircraft from the Shokaku and Zuikaku had found our task force and launched their own strike. 78 aircraft, Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters were heading straight for us. I landed aboard the Lexington just as general quarters was being sounded. The ship's klaxons were wailing, and sailors were running to their battle stations. From the bridge, Admiral Fitch's voice came over the loudspeaker. Enemy aircraft approaching from the northeast. All aircraft prepare for immediate launch. There was no time to refuel or rearm. Those of us who still had ammunition took off again immediately, while the ships prepared to defend themselves with anti-aircraft fire. The Lexington and Yorktown began evasive maneuvers, their massive hulls carving white wakes through the blue water as they turned and twisted to avoid the incoming attack. The Japanese strike was expertly coordinated. The Kate torpedo bombers came in low from both sides simultaneously, forcing our ships to divide their defensive fire. The Val dive bombers attacked from high altitude, their fixed landing gear making them look like deadly birds of prey as they plummeted toward our carriers. I was back in the air in my Dauntless, along with every other flyable aircraft from both carriers. We had no torpedoes or bombs left, just machine gun ammunition, but we threw ourselves at the Japanese formation with everything we had. The air battle was unlike anything I'd experienced. Japanese Zeros twisted and turned through the formation of American fighters, their superior maneuverability giving them an advantage in dogfighting. But our Wildcat pilots were learning, using their aircraft's superior durability and firepower to their advantage. I lined up on a Kate torpedo bomber that was making its approach to the Lexington. The twin-engine aircraft was flying straight and level, making Eton easy target for my forward firing. 50 caliber machine guns. I squeezed the trigger and watched my tracers walk across the bomber's starboard engine. Smoke began streaming from the cowling, and the Kate wavered in its flight path. But the Japanese pilot was determined to complete his attack. Even with his engine on fire, he held course until he was close enough to drop his torpedo. The weapon splashed into the water just 500 yards from the Lexington, its wake heading straight for the carrier's hull. Captain Sherman on the Lexington was ready for it. The massive ship heeled over in a tight turn, her 33,000-ton bulk responding to the helm with surprising grace. The torpedo passed harmlessly down the carrier's starboard side, missing by mere yards. The battle raged for nearly 30 minutes. When it was over, the Japanese had lost 21 aircraft, while we'd lost only 3. But the cost wasn't measured just in aircraft. The Yorktown had taken one bomb hit that penetrated deep into her hull, killing 66 men and starting serious fires. But her damage control parties, trained to perfection after months of war, managed to contain the damage and keep the ship operational. The Lexington hadn't been so lucky. 2 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits left her with a serious list and multiple fires. But like the Yorktown, her crew seemed to have the situation under control. Within an hour, the fires were out and the ship was back to making 25 knots. We thought we'd dodged the bullet. We were wrong. At 12:47, while I was below in the ready room writing my after-action report, a massive explosion shook the Lexington from bow to stern. The lights went out, and the ship rolled heavily to port before righting herself. Emergency klaxons began wailing throughout the ship. What we didn't know was that gasoline vapor from damaged fuel lines had been building up in the carrier's hull. A single spark from an electric motor was all it took to trigger a devastating internal explosion that killed 25 men instantly and started uncontrollable fires deep in the ship's belly. For the next several hours, the crew of the Lexington fought valiantly to save their ship. Captain Sherman and his damage control parties tried everything, flooding compartments, counter-flooding to correct the list, even jettisoning aircraft and ammunition to reduce weight. But the fires were spreading faster than they could be contained. At 14:45, another massive explosion rocked the ship. This time, the blast was so violent that it blew the forward elevator completely off its tracks, sending the 3-inch steel platform cartwheeling through the air like a giant frisbee. I was on deck by then, helping to move wounded sailors to the stern where they could be evacuated to the destroyers. The heat from the fires was so intense that paint was blistering on the bulkheads, and smoke was pouring from every opening in the ship. At 15:07, Captain Sherman made the hardest decision of his naval career. Prepared to abandon ship. The evacuation was conducted with the same professionalism that had marked every other aspect of the Lexington service. There was no panic, no pushing or shoving. Officers and men formed orderly lines as the destroyers Morris, Anderson, Hammond, and Russell moved in close to take off survivors. I was among the last to leave, helping to carry stretchers to the destroyer that would take us to safety. As I stepped across from the Lexington's flight deck to the destroyer's rails, I turned back for one last look at the ship that had been my home for the past 8 months. She was still beautiful, even dying. Her massive hull gleamed in the afternoon sun, and her flight deck, where I'd launched on dozens of missions, stretched out like an enormous runway. But the smoke pouring from her wounds told the story. The Lexington was doomed. At 7:56, Admiral Fletcher made the final decision. Rather than let the Lexington fall into enemy hands or become a navigation hazard, the destroyer Phelps was ordered to sink her with torpedoes. 5 torpedo hits were needed to finally send the grand old lady to the bottom. She went down bow first, her massive propellers still turning as she disappeared beneath the Coral Sea. 216 of her crew went down with her, along with 36 aircraft. But even in death, the Lexington had achieved something remarkable. Along with the Yorktown, she had fought the world's first carrier versus carrier battle and emerged victorious. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had been stopped, Australia was safe, and American naval aviation had proven it could take on the best the Japanese Navy had to offer. The battle's toll on the Japanese was devastating, even beyond the loss of the Shoho. The fleet carrier Shokaku had been so badly damaged by our dive bombers that she would be out of action for months. The Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft that she too would be unavailable for future operations until her air group could be rebuilt. More importantly, we'd eliminated 2 experienced Japanese carrier air groups. The pilots and aircrew lost at Coral Sea couldn't be easily replaced. Japan was already beginning to feel the strain off trying to maintain operations across the vast Pacific, and every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. The Japanese claimed victory at Coral Sea because they'd sunk a fleet carrier while losing only a light carrier. But strategic victories aren't always measured in tonnage. We'd stopped their advance toward Australia, bloodied 2 of their best carrier air groups, and proven that American naval aviation was a force to be reckoned with. 3 weeks later, the Japanese would pay an even higher price at Midway, where 4 fleet carriers would go to the bottom along with their irreplaceable air groups. But it all started here, in the Coral Sea, with the sinking of the Shoho. As I sit in my quarters aboard the Yorktown, writing this account, I can still see that moment of triumph when my bomb hit the Japanese carrier's flight deck. The orange flash of the explosion, the column of smoke and debris, the knowledge that we'd finally struck back at the enemy who had attacked us at Pearl Harbor. But I also remember the men who didn't come home. The 216 sailors who went down with the Lexington. The aircrews who never made it back to the ship. The Japanese sailors on the Shoho who died doing their duty, just as we were doing ours. War is a terrible thing, even when you're on the winning side. Every victory comes at a cost, and that cost is always measured in human lives. The young Japanese pilot I saw bail out of his burning Zero was somebody's son, just as I'm somebody's son. The difference was, on May 7, 1942, we were better prepared, better trained, and luckier than they were. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked a turning point in the Pacific War. For the first time, the Japanese advance had been stopped. For the first time, American air power had sunk an enemy aircraft carrier. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans could look at the war in the Pacific with something approaching optimism. The Shoho was just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, American naval aviation will sink or damage dozens of Japanese carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The industrial might of America would eventually overwhelm Japan's initial advantages in experience and training. But it all started here, with 93 American aircraft diving out of the dawn sky to attack a Japanese carrier that thought she was safe. In that moment, when Lieutenant Commander Dixon's voice crackled over the radio with those immortal words, "Scratch 1 flat top," the tide of war in the Pacific began to turn. The Japanese had been horrified to lose their first aircraft carrier to American air power. They had good reason to be. It wouldn't their last.